Okay, welcome to the University of Virginia's Institute of World Languages Spring Speaker Series. I'm Assistant Professor of Spanish Linguistics, Omar Velázquez. And our speaker today is Hoff. Joe is Interim Dean of International Education at the University of Richmond. His PhD in Comparative and International Development Education is from the University of Minnesota. He also holds an MA in International Administration. But for obvious reasons, Joe's most important degrees are not the ones I have just mentioned, but rather his BA and MA in the language of Cervantes, Spanish, from San Luis University. Before joining the University of Richmond, Joe held positions at Oregon State University, at which institution he was director of the International Degree and Education Abroad Office, and at Brown, where he was Assistant Director of the Office of International Programs. In addition to finally seeing the light when studying abroad in Spain, Joe taught English in the Shizuoka Japan Exchange Program. He was also an intern in Lugano, Switzerland. Joe's research focuses on the assessment of the teaching of culture and unsuccessful language learning strategies during sojourn abroad experiences. Today, Joe will be speaking on using culture and language learning strategies programs to ensure a successful sojourn abroad. Please join me in welcoming Joe Hoff.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have a small group today, so I would ask that if you do have questions during my presentation, please feel free to ask questions and any clarification that you need as well. I'll start by saying that this is based on my research many years ago. Language learning strategies, and I have focused more since my time at Minnesota on the cultural learning strategies with my work with study abroad and international education. So I may be a little rusty on my language learning strategies, but please bear with me. And as many of you know, this was with work that I did with Carla. I don't know if you know Carla, the Center for Advanced Research and Language Acquisition at the University of Minnesota, a really renowned institution where they do things such as workshops on less commonly taught languages, all those type of things. A wonderful place to work at, although it's a bit warmer here, which I like, than Minnesota. What we're going to talk about today, language and culture learning in study abroad, some examples of practical courses that are out there in different universities around the country now, both online and in person, using these materials. And then also some time on a program that I currently run at the University of Richmond, which is the Cultures and Languages Across the Curriculum, helping globalize any discipline, theoretically. So, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. So with language and culture learning, just to explain a little bit about what that means, is teaching students how to learn, right? How to learn about another culture, and also strategies, thoughts on how to better learn a language using the host country context where they are located, right? And this is the same with culture, so culture strategies. And what that means may not necessarily be particular strategies. When you think of strategies, you're thinking of, planning ways to get from there to here, or here to there, or those kind of things, but concepts, right? To help them understand what culture means. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Looking at best practices at different universities, and then also learning how at the University of Richmond we reinforce the learning our students have while abroad through the Cultures and Languages Across the Curriculum program. Oops, I went too fast there. Part of the other, I think I have one more slide. Part of the other goal is to think about what are our outcomes for our students, right? What do we want when our students go abroad or when they're learning a language, learning about another culture? So I've just recently read a book by David Killick, and he talks about the self in the world. And I really like this concept, meaning that even in Charlottesville, Virginia, we need to start teaching our students that we are part of the world, right? It's not just the United States is here and the rest of the world is there, but we are ourselves in the world. And so that means we could come across Spanish speakers here in the United States, we could come across immigrants. I mean, all of us are part of this larger world. And so we need to develop these skills and values which enable us to act in the world, to understand the world, and to act in the world, be part of this global citizenship concept that's out there. And so this means looking at all aspects, including cognitive aspects, history, artifacts, holidays, those type of things, learning how to adapt our behavior when we're interacting with someone else from another part of the world. And then also, as I put here, affective change, meaning do we appreciate other cultures? Do we look forward to interacting with people from other cultures, which is a big part of this because we're all human, right? We all have emotions and we all either think something is good or a little strange or something like that. How do we encourage our students to become more positive, more appreciative of other cultures? So what I'm going to focus on is opportunities for interactions with native speakers of a target language in the study abroad context, the potential for students to make significant gains in target language proficiency and to develop intercultural skills. And also, the reality is, as Barbara Fried you've seen this research, they don't often make these gains even in a study abroad context. And so in her research, their peers who had stayed at home gained more than they did while they were abroad. So what is the benefit of study abroad, right? If we are only asking our students to be in a certain place without taking full advantage of that study abroad location. And that's what these strategies, as I call them, and the University of Minnesota calls them, are about. Helping them understand better ways to take advantage of that local context rather than just being there, which some of them tend to be. So the reality is most study abroad students are unprepared. And we've talked just before this about what are ways that we can prepare them through pre-departure courses, those types of things. We'll talk about that a little more today. They lack these strategies to think about how they can integrate better, how they can meet local natives. Also, what they don't know, they're not going to look for. So when we're talking about culture, if they don't understand what that means, if they don't even understand they have their own culture, then they're not going to look for other cultural traits from other peoples, right? And then the practical aspect, how do we train them and encourage students to be strategic about their learning while abroad? These are the realities that we're working with. And of course, I don't have all the answers, but this is just one perspective on what we can do with our students who are studying abroad. So what is strategies-based learning? Basically, it's based on the constructivist approach, meaning that learning occurs as learners are actively involved in a process of meaning and knowledge construction as opposed to passively receiving them, right? And so it's enhancing their language and learning and culture learning. It's helping them reflect on what they're learning so that they are processing the learning that happens when they're abroad. Often you may hear anecdotally that students don't really understand something until 3 months after they've returned, right? Because they finally have time to think about it and reflect on what they've learned while they were abroad and to compare back in the United States the things that they have learned abroad. And here's another definition of language and culture learning strategies. Learners' conscious and semi-conscious thoughts and behaviors having the explicit goal of improving the knowledge and understanding of the second language and culture, as well as strategies for using the language and cultural insights that have been learned or for getting around gaps in language proficiency or cultural knowledge. So for example, and I'll also use this example later. Have any of you heard of the describe, interpret, and evaluate exercise? You have, okay? You have, all right. So this is taking what we call in our field a critical incident. Let's say I lived in Japan, right? So when I asked somebody if I could do something, and they said, "Oh, muzukashii desu," which means it's difficult. Well, that's not a direct no, right? But I may have understood that maybe, from a U.S. perspective, that maybe that is still a way to do something. But when I just talked to a Japanese native, and I asked them, what do you think she meant or he meant by muzukashii desu? And they will tell me, oh, that means you can't do that, right? Even though they said difficult, which still leaves a little opening in English, in Japanese, that pretty much means no, right? Because they don't say no, because that would be too direct. But in this way, you are consulting somebody who's a native speaker to understand exactly what they're saying here. So with describe, interpret, and evaluate, you could work with students to say, first of all, describe what happened, right? Just total description, no judgments whatsoever, right? No bringing in your own cultural interpretation, but just describing. And then ask them, well, let's interpret that. What do you think, now that you may know something about the Japanese culture, what might actually be happening here, right? And what might be the real reason? And then maybe consult somebody who's a native speaker and then find out from them what they think. And then evaluation focuses on your feelings, going back to that affective piece. Well, do you think it's a little strange that they didn't say no to you directly? Why didn't they just say no? We can say that here, but it may seem a little strange that for us. And so then you have to avoid those judgments, right, as well when you're working in a cross-cultural situation, so that that's not fogging up your perception of what's really going on. Does that make sense? I use actually a business meeting case study for this describe, interpret, and evaluate exercise, where there's an intern who is in a meeting, but nothing really happens in the meeting in terms of arguing or anything, and then everybody agrees that this has been done, right? And in reality, everything happened beforehand. Individual meetings with the head boss, he gained consensus, and so in the overall meeting, there's no arguing, and they're just saying everybody agrees, because that way you avoid losing face in Japanese culture, right? In this case, again, when I use this with students, they think, well, why aren't they arguing? Immediately, what's the judgment is, why aren't they arguing? Why aren't they doing this and that? Again, coming from our own personal cultural perspective, our US-centric. So it's a great exercise to help them just stop and think very quickly about what's going on. Stop yourself, and you can do this in 5 minutes on your own sometimes without having to do it as a formal exercise. Language learning strategies can focus on, as many of you know, reading for understanding, right? Or active listening. How do you teach someone to do active listening, focusing on the main point when they're in discussion with someone? I remember when I studied abroad in Spain, I couldn't understand anyone at the beginning, even though I had been up past the intermediate level, the advanced level, and it took a while for my ear to adjust. And then I really started learning to listen for those main points, and that way I started gaining more comprehension little by little. But I didn't have anybody teach me that. And so this is an idea to help our students think about these strategies before they go, or even while they're there, so that they can take advantage again of the local context and really learn much more quickly than somebody like me who didn't have any of this, right? So as it says, language and cultural strategies help students learn how to learn. And this goes on even beyond the study abroad experience and after they're finished with college. And what I'm going to talk about is cultural general in terms of the cultural learning strategies, culture general culture learning strategies, and not specific, although you can use culture-specific information and knowledge alongside with the culture general strategies, all right? And it shows that research suggests that explicit teaching of language strategies is an effective way to help students improve their language proficiency. So another example of a culture strategy, real quickly, I'll throw out culture learning strategy. And I've got the books here. I hope that you will come up and look at these sometime, Maximizing the Study Abroad. Has anybody seen these? And you can pass them around. There's two guides, a language instructor's guide and also a student's guide that students can take with them. And I'll pass these around. But in here, there's an exercise where they list its work based on Goethe Hofstede. Anybody? Of course, you all know Goethe Hofstede's work, right? So they came up with a chart of different values continuums, right? So, for example, collectivism versus individualism, direct versus indirect, hierarchy versus equality, or my favorite, polychronic versus monochronic, time concept, right? And then the students are asked, and again, this can be very informal or informal as a conversation, students are asked to plot where their own culture is on these continuums, and then to think about where their host culture might be on these continuums. And of course, we have to explain that it's a lot more complex than just these two values across from each other. There's a lot more involved, but it gives them an idea of, first of all, if they're learning about their own culture, what it, is the US, generally speaking, more individualistic versus collectivist? Is it more of a direct culture? And of course, the complexity in this can be that it's different within regions, right? Regions of our country, the communication style may be more direct or indirect depending on where you are. So this gives them an idea of understanding what culture means and the values behind culture that influence behavior and communication, right? Different cultures have different behavior and different communication styles, not because it's just that's the way they are, but there are actually values behind these. Values meaning that these came into practice over centuries and a long time, and therefore, they have developed in such a way so that, for example, in a very hierarchical culture like the Japanese culture, there's a lot of respect that has to be given to the person you're talking to, and vice versa, because of this development of a very strong hierarchical value within their culture and within their language, right? Any questions about that? So, ways to classify language strategies, and again, this is where I'm a little rusty, but many of you probably already know this. So they give, for example, language learning strategies, identifying, distinguishing, grouping, memory strategies, so retrieval, rehearsal, communicative, and cover strategies. Metacognitive refers to arrangement and planning of your learning, centering your learning and evaluating your learning efforts and outcomes. Cognitive assumes that responses are also the result of insight and intentional patterning, so many patterns that you can come up with. For language learning, insight can be directed to the concepts behind language, i.e., in other words, to traditional grammar. It can also be directed to language as an operation, sets of communicative functions. So one of the professors, Andrew Cohen, I don't know if you know him at all, at the University of Minnesota, came up with speech acts, for example. How can we teach our students to identify speech acts such as apologies? When you make an apology, how is that different in French versus English, for example? And so in this case, sets of communicative functions, you could focus on teaching students that, and like, again, I tend to use Japanese examples a lot because it's quite different from the US context. When someone says to you in Japanese, oh, you speak Japanese very well, your response, if your response is, oh, thank you, then they know you don't speak Japanese very well, right? I mean, because you're supposed to respond, oh, no, I don't speak Japanese very well. That's the proper response, because again, you're humbling yourself in front of the other person. So that's one way of having these sets of communicative functions as a way to teach students and train them to think about specific operations of language that they can focus on. The affective piece is on attitudes, beliefs, and values that influence what learners focus on most in learning situations. And social strategies are preferred degree of involvement with other people while learning. So these are different ways to classify language strategies, as well as by skill, which you all know: listening, speaking, reading, writing, vocabulary, translation. And then other ways by proficiency levels, specific cultures, i.e. learning the language of a specific culture, or by specific languages. Because as we all know, different languages have different grammar structures, very different contexts than other languages, and so they may need a very specific focus than others, such as Romance languages, which may be a little closer to English than, say, Japanese or Chinese. So an example of a listening strategy, and I'll let you read this rather than myself reading this, and I'll take a quick drink of water. Can you all see that in the back? And what we did, and I'll talk about the research a little bit, we actually had students go abroad, and we taught them the strategies online, and this is the research that came out, the results that came out of it. So this is a more qualitative result. But here this person says, I was with my language partner and a friend, and they were talking really fast, so I just listened for key words, and I caught the gist of the conversation. Later, I wasn't afraid to ask them questions about what they said, and that helped clear up any uncertainties that I had. And feel free, if you want to look at the instructional guide, you're welcome to look at that as well. But again, if you have not learned in this way previously, you may not know how to do this, right? So if we're trying to help our students gain the most out of their study abroad experience, then we need to help them think about ways to do that, right? This is a speaking strategy. I've also been trying to work on my communication skills by being more aggressive and adding comments to a conversation. I'm not as afraid to say I don't understand or repeat that a little slower, please. These tactics from the student's guide that's being passed around have helped me a lot, and I have been successful in communicating with Mexicans. So culture strategies, again, to me, the strategy was the word that my advisor came up with. Culture learning strategies are, to me, more of learning concepts that help us understand what culture really means, right? Again, focusing on values differences, on communication styles. We talked about the DIE model. And then also, when in a study abroad context, how they may need to take a break every once in a while from being in the other culture, because that can be very stressful. The same with learning a language. If you're using it all the time, you get tired, physically tired, and you may need to take a break. I know sometimes when I tell students to really immerse themselves in another culture or learning a language, I also caution them and I say, but sometimes you're going to need to take a break, and that's okay. Don't worry about it. Speaking English with your friends are okay, is okay every once in a while. Another example of communication styles is, just because I haven't talked about communication styles as much, is attached or detached communication styles. In the United States, we generally speaking use a more detached form of discussion with each other. So help, and say in cultures such as Spain, as Russia, Middle East, a more attached style, meaning more engaged, more using emotions, using gestures possibly. So understanding that that's a cultural difference, right? Helping them understand that versus, someone's not becoming aggressive with you or something like that. And again, depending on your students, you can leave some of these out or use them depending on the level of your students, because some of them may have already had intercultural experiences and they understand some of these things already. So I'll give you some examples of a culture learning strategy that was used by students. Let's see. and this is very important, the articulation of all this. Sometimes, let's see, I felt like the cultural readings were really relevant to my experience here. This person was in Cameroon, so a quite culturally distant culture to the United States. One of the greatest things about this guide is that it helps put new words to things we've been struggling with, things that are inherent part of any experience, like study abroad. Sometimes it names the things we struggle with and helps us recognize that they're there. Often you'll struggle in a situation, feel irritated or discouraged, but not really be sure why, and then you do your readings for the week and you realize the source of the problem. I sit up late at nights reading in my mosquito net and all of a sudden think, oh, it's because I'm a linear communicator and she's a circular communicator, right? So one of the exercises is talking about linear versus circular communication styles, meaning, and I'm dealing with this a lot, not only with study abroad students, but my international students who come to the University of Richmond, where they may have a very different writing style than our sort of form of essay that we require our students to write, right? They may be, especially my Japanese students, start off with sort of a more general, very sort of flowery beginning, and then they somehow get to the point, but it's not quite as direct and linear as our essays are required here in the US. So it can be writing as well. But because the student now understands, again, that this is a communication style difference, and it's not necessarily that person, or they don't understand the purpose of the circular communication style originally, now it's easier for them to understand why people are doing what they're doing in another cultural context, right? So we're helping them grasp the meaning and the value behind that, right? Circular communication style, again, you don't want to be too direct, right? You're trying to save face, you're trying to honor the person you're talking to, and so therefore not being too direct. So I know this sounds a little bit like a show for these guys, but I just want to run through them real quickly as well. I pass around the student's guide, just go through this very quickly. There's 2 of them. One of the other great things that's involved is that if you're thinking about this on a holistic level, learning how our students learn is very important. So there are learning style preference surveys to understand, are students, wanting to learn by media? Do they learn better by media? Do they learn better by journaling? Those types of things to help us understand how to teach them better. That allows us to really create a varied program for students from different learning styles to match their learning style, keep them as interested as possible. This talks about the different theories and those kind of things, which I'll go into a little bit, Milton Bennett's stages of intercultural development. And then the other things that are included, other theories, how language and culture are interconnected, this theory of challenge and support for a learning environment in a study abroad program. I'll go into this a little bit, meaning we don't want to challenge our students too much, have a very immersive experience where they shut down because it's too much for them, versus the opposite, which is that if we don't give them enough to learn at one time, they may become bored as well. So learning how to really create an environment where they are challenged enough and supported enough that they will learn at their highest level. And what's great about this guide, the instructional guide, I'll pass it around, is that it has a whole section of activities that are already made up that you can use. And this was a grant that the University of Minnesota received from the Department of Education. So, you can copy all these without a problem and use them, revise them as you want, etc. In that second section, I believe it is. So the surveys that they use, again, which I recommend, are these 3 surveys: Learning Styles Survey, the Language Strategy Use Inventory and Index, and Culture Learning Strategies Inventory and Index. I won't go into all these very in-depth because that may take a long time, But for example, culture learning strategies inventory asks, how do you find out, how do you try to understand something when there's a problem, for example? What do you do in that situation? That's one question on that. The learning style survey I'll go into in a section. You've got some examples of the language strategy use inventory. So these are what they cover, use rhyming, make a mental image of the word, write out new words in meaningful sentences. These are all sort of strategies that are used in the Maximizing Study Abroad Guide series. And then they rate the choices. For example, I use this strategy and I like it. That type of thing, to give you an example of how that works. And here's the culture learning strategies inventory. Respect the way people from other cultures express their emotions. I recently had a student who told me that it was very odd for them to kiss on two cheeks in Spain, but then they got used to it and then they appreciated it and now they're doing it and they want to do it here, but they're finding people here don't want to do it. So, respecting the way different people, express their emotions and their greetings, that type of thing. Refrain from disagreeing right away so they have a chance to listen what others are trying to communicate. So these are, again, ideas for them to really stop and think, how do I approach somebody who's from another culture? How do I interact with them so that I am open enough to learning about the new culture, the new language? So here's an example of from a language instructor that used these guide series. The surveys were great in helping me realize all the different ways a student can learn. I don't think I was clearly aware of the wide variety of students' learning styles and thus did not teach as well to students whose learning styles varied from my own. So this professor was very focused on the learning styles. And at the end, I realized that fewer than 25% of the students seemed to share my learning style. So she really realized that she was using her learning style over that of the students. So other examples of strategies, as we call them from the guides. You as a culturally diverse person is a flower, basically. This is for students who have never been out of the country before. I mean, it could be for those who have been, but really for those who have never been out. It's a flower with petals, and then there's a center where they put you, right? And then on each petal, they have to describe what is their culture, right? What is their culture? And then the way we approached this was to then think about how will your cultural identity be appreciated where you're going on study abroad. So at the University of Minnesota, when we did this exercise, we had one student I remember who wrote in there in one of the petals, he's a hunter, which hunting is a big thing in Minnesota, right? And he was going to Berlin. So he was thinking, how would he describe being a hunter to someone from the big cosmopolitan city of Berlin, right? And so this is helping him think about what his values are, what his culture is, and then how that's going to work in this new cultural setting where he's never been before, and thinking about how to express that to the Germans that they're going to meet. The other thing is looking at stereotypes and generalizations, the difference between those two, because often, and this is very helpful for my international students, because every time I have an orientation with them, I immediately ask them, so what are your stereotypes of US culture, right? And we talk about, and they may say, Americans are fat, everybody owns a gun, all these kind of stereotypes that they see from media, right? Now, many of our students, I find, who are going out, don't have the same capacity to know any stereotypes because they may not have exposure to the media like international students who come to the United States do of the US culture. But I help them think then this exercise talks about the difference between the two. And then the last thing is, and of course generalizations, the difference we say is generalizations you can generally identify by using the terms most people do this, many people do this, right? And then having them think about finding out what is the reality, right? When they hear a generalization, or a stereotype, what is the reality, right? A stereotype we define in the guide as it's it's a judgment that comes out of not having sufficient information, right, about something. They may have heard one thing, or they saw one thing in a movie, but it's really not sufficient information. Generalization is a little broader than that, a little grander than that, but how can they develop a sense of testing any kind of stereotype or generalization that they may have about a particular culture? And that's the strategy, making sure that they don't accept that right away, but how to come up with hypotheses and then test those. Again, asking native speakers, do you do this, in your culture? Does everybody do this, or is it only certain groups of people? Getting at the complexity of your culture as well. So helping them get beyond those, and also working with the ones that they may experience when they're abroad, because often our students who go abroad come across stereotypes of U.S. Citizens when on the other side, and all of a sudden they're having to defend their own culture, which they've never had to do previously. Language activities, a critical reading strategy. I remember reading Don Quixote in Spain, and it was a long book, and it took me forever to get through, so I wish I had learned how to do more sort of critical reading, looking for the main points, looking for particular words, and skimming, not reading necessarily for, having to translate every word. So helping them think, how can they learn in the most efficient way possible in order to gain the main ideas of what they are learning. So also at the University of Minnesota, they have used these strategies in a regular language classroom here. So for example, preparing students to go abroad. They may have a section, and especially if there are many students in Spanish, for example, who study abroad, they may have a particular section for students who may be going abroad for the following semester. And so you can use that here in country, not only in a study abroad context, but also here in country. What we're saying here is that, for example, without understanding the difference between stereotypes and generalizations, students may develop negative stereotypes about the target culture. For example, being unaware that personal distance varies across cultures can create misunderstandings in the target language communication. So this is a way, even before they go abroad, they're starting to think about these things to prepare them for that semester or even a summer program abroad. All right, let me go in here. Sorry. So then, how does this work in terms of what are practical possibilities for using these cultures and language learning strategies in classroom? As I mentioned, there are those in Minnesota and elsewhere now that are using them in a regular class before students are going abroad, using them in field research. If you're doing a study abroad program that has maybe a component where they have to go out and interact with locals and do a project of some sort. Also in academic advising, helping students understand, let's say in reentry, how much they have gained by their study abroad experience, and then learning how to, by taking, for example, one of the surveys, how much they have gained and how much now they can articulate what they have gained, and so therefore continue maybe in another class or prepare for life after college. And then also in study abroad credit-bearing courses that are either offered in the 3 sections, pre-departure, while students are on site, or reentry or reentry, I should say. So examples of these, the Spanish 315 and medical Spanish course. In this course, like I said, that was being offered at the University of Minnesota, this was the semester before students had studied abroad, and the maximizing study abroad materials are integrated into the regular language curriculum, so part of the grammar as well. For the medical Spanish, and you can imagine that they often interact with speakers of Spanish. They integrate, and this is at a higher level, they integrate these strategies-based learning into the health professional courses and ask them to actually use these when they are interacting with native Spanish speakers, for example. And to help them to start becoming observers of the people that they're working with, to see if there are these same kind of sort of cultural differences that occur, or communication styles differences that occur while they're working with them. So these are examples of courses here in the United States that are using these strategies. For the field research, the students in the program were in a number of different disciplines in the sciences and humanities. Students used pre-departure, in-country, and re-entry activities in the guides. And this was a group that went to Ethiopia and then started using these strategies or concepts while they were in Ethiopia on this field study course. And then in terms of advising, like I said, it helps students assess their comprehensions of cultural differences and also to assess their re-entry. Oops, I went too far. So what are these based on, the theories behind these? We'll get into this in a second. First of all, as I mentioned already, the learning style theories that we talked about earlier, which are, for example, psychological type, whether they're extrovert, introvert, random, intuitive, cognitive types, are they deductive, inductive, impulsive, repulsive ideas? That these are the types of looking at the different students' learning styles so that you can understand how they learn and you can react to their learning styles by incorporating activities and lessons to benefit their learning styles in the classroom. Also, we use Kolb a lot. Is anyone familiar with the experiential learning model? Okay, which the experiential learning model talks about. It's a circular approach, right? Model of having a concrete experience. Then there is reflective observation, and then out of the reflective observation comes abstract conceptualization, and then putting that into use again into active experimentation. So that, for example, the example I gave earlier, where this Japanese person responds muzukashi, whether that means yes or no, or maybe it's still an opening, you can use this as the example was this person received this muzukashi response, right? They thought about it, thought maybe I should check in with somebody to see what this really means. They checked in with someone, a native speaker, to understand what that really meant, learned about this, and then they thought in the abstract conceptualization piece, well, this shows how indirect Japanese culture really is. And so in the future, in their own use of this term, they then understand better how to use the term as the active experimentation in the future. So bringing it to full circle. Other theories that I'm going to go into shortly. I know we're getting to 4:30 already, and I need a quick drink of water. Intercultural competence, meaning that our students are able to effectively interact with people from host culture citizens from host cultural countries, meaning that they understand the cognitive complexity behind cultural differences. They have the emotional, again, positive approach to cultural differences, not judging right away, not having a negative judgment feeling towards them, and also able to adapt to their behavior, understanding what they need to do in order to interact effectively with someone from another culture. And so by having those concepts that I mentioned previously, values differences, communication styles, that's all part of understanding the differences in cultures, and so therefore able to arrive at an interculturally competent mindset. No matter what culture you interact with, you are able to learn and observe and learn from the people you're interacting with, and therefore quickly pick up the correct behavior, the correct communication to working with them effectively. The next one, how many of you are familiar with Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity? Anyone at all? No? Okay. All right, so I'll talk about this very quickly. This is a 6-stage model of, it's a development of intercultural sensitivity going from, can be viewed as either ethnocentrism to ethnorelativism, or what you could also call monocultural perspective to a polycultural perspective, right? And the 6 stages are denial, and I'm from the Midwest, so I can pick on the Midwest. If you're in the middle of nowhere where there aren't many different cultures, it's a benign sort of denial that cultural differences exist, right? And so you may not have any negative feelings for them. You just don't even know that there are cultural differences. Defense, which is definitely a negative approach to cultural difference, which can be exhibited in this culture, for example, with extreme examples like white supremacists, people like that. There's also a subset to that, which is part of this monocultural view of reversal. For example, a Peace Corps volunteer who goes abroad and takes on the new culture as the culture and gives up their own culture, right? They become sort of, what do they call that? Go native. They go native. And so therefore they still, the reason why it's ethnocentric is that they are not becoming more of a polycultural view. It's just focusing on one culture as the best culture. And then going into this, minimization, a very important stage of this model, which most of our college students tend to be, because it's a very strong value within the United States culture, which is we're all the same, right? We all focus on similarities. We might notice that there are different foods, different clothes, things like that. But in reality, but the mindset is we're all the same. Or another way to say it, we're all human beings, we're all God's children, those kind of things. When in reality, right, talking about these underlying cultural differences, there are strong differences where that are demonstrated in behavior and communication, as I've given examples previously. And so it's still a monocultural, it's getting there, but it's still a monocultural view because why? They're still focusing as, you're like me, you're a human being. We're the same, but in reality, you're like me, is what this is saying. And this tends to be where there's an instrument that goes along with the developmental model in cultural sensitivity, and this tends to be where most college students are before they go abroad. And so therefore, again, you have another problem with trying to help them understand cultural differences because they're approaching it as there aren't any. We're all the same, right? We're all the same. So trying to get them past that stage. Then the more ethno-relative or polycultural stages of this are acceptance, meaning that they now start appreciating cultural differences. They understand that it's not just this surface view. Many of you have probably seen this iceberg concept of culture, right? The top of the iceberg is sort of clothes and food and things like that. But then underneath that we don't see very easily are the values differences and those kind of things. And so getting to acceptance is you're starting to look at more of the underlying values differences that cause cultural differences, right? And then adaptation refers to behavior. Now you are able to adapt your behavior to new cultural contexts so that you're You know, you've heard the term probably code shift, right? Code shifting. So you can easily code shift, almost be sort of bicultural, bilingual. And the final stage is integration, which for the most part is only for bicultural, bilingual people. They quickly switch back and forth. Most of us don't ever get to that stage who are not born biculturally. So the purpose of this model is to talk about how people interact with cultural difference, the worldview. So these 6 stages are worldviews on how someone approaches cultural difference. And the guides are very strongly based on this type of theory, model of, with the idea of constructivism, as I mentioned before, helping students get through the different stages, especially to adaptation, the last stage, so that they are, again, interculturally competent, such as I mentioned before with that first theory. And then in some places now they are teaching, there are actually places where they teach through this developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, and they teach activities, using activities like from the Maximizing Study Abroad Guide series to actually try to help students progress to higher stages. And there are other models like this as well. I'm not saying this is the only one, but this is the one that I've been, what should we say, brainwashed in, I suppose, from my advisor. Other ideas, intensity factors. When you're working with, let's say, students who are going to Senegal versus students who are going to England, talking about how the intensity factors in those cultures or in the experience may differ based on the location. And so you may want to plan a different activity with someone going to London versus someone going to Senegal, right? I mean, just based on that. So examples of intensity factors include distance from US culture, again, Senegal versus in England, students' ethnocentrism levels. They may not have the same approach to someone from Senegal as they do to someone from London, for example. Language differences, of course, how much more difficult is the language because of the difference in language, like Arabic versus Spanish, for example. Visibility versus invisibility of the student. When I lived in Japan, I was very visible. I'm tall, I'm white, and so that affected how I felt about the Japanese culture in many ways. When you have little kids come up to you running and screaming, "Gaijin, gaijin da," you know, which means foreigner, there's a foreigner, then that, you know, it's a little different than when you're in Spain or England, where you're kind of just more of the background, right? I mean, Spain less so than England, but still it affects on how you approach the culture. Another aspect of that, right? And then, for example, how much, in terms of power control, living arrangements. If you have students living together in one apartment so that they're in an American bubble versus living in a homestay, where, for example, in my homestay in Spain, I was told, don't go into the kitchen, right? And I kind of took that the wrong way initially until I learned that, generally speaking, guests don't go into the kitchen ever, right? I mean, and the house mother is the dueña of that kitchen, right? And she wouldn't want anybody to go into the kitchen except herself. So then, again, that's an example of how I learned the culture, and so that made me feel better at the end. I understood, you know, why this was the situation as it was. Balance and support, I talked about that a little bit already. Again, thinking about, and there's a good model, a good sort of diagram about balance and support in the instructional guide. Thinking again about, is this activity going to be too much or is it going to be too little? I don't know if any of you know the SIT study abroad programs. They are famous for doing the drop-off. Have you heard of that activity? They take a group of students and they take them to a particular corner where they've never been before of a city or someplace like that, and they drop them off. And they say, you need to find your way back to such and such a place. Now, this is not done right away. It's not done like the first few days, but it's done maybe a week or two into the program, and they've already been able to establish, you know, at least language, certain, you know, survival language and things like that. But for some students, that may be a little too much. and they may freak out to be dropped off in the middle of the car, and have to find their way back. But, for other students who are in London, for example, this might be a great activity. And of course, they can speak English there, and that might be a way that they are interacting with natives, and so therefore gaining a lot out of that experience. So keeping in mind how much is too much and how much is too little when working with students in this area. Teach what to teach when, basically. Okay, I talked about, this is about the research project. I'm going to go through these real quickly. This was the research question. So the idea here is an intervention, right? I'm promoting that we have an intervention with our students who study abroad and helping them learn these strategies, learn how to learn in order to gain the most from their experience. I'm just going to go through these quickly because we're almost at 4:30. We also worked with Spanish, 3 Spanish instructors and 1 French instructor who incorporated these into their classroom. This is how we got our data collection. One nice comment came out about how this professor felt that it allowed her, let's see, she says something also about how she felt like it allowed her to really show the students that she was interested in their learning and not just, learning grammar for grammar or those types of things. Let's see. That I am really serious about helping them learn, and they seem to appreciate it so much. Problems, let's see, I'm going to go through this quickly. I talked a lot longer than I thought I was going to. This is current course models, pre-departure. Part of this is to think about when you're teaching pre-departure, what are students most interested in? And again, it depends on your type of students, right? If they've never been out of the country before, are they going to understand what it means to have a value difference? Maybe not. Maybe you need to do this flower exercise to help them first start thinking about their own culture. What does that mean? What does it mean? So again, learning how, or thinking about what should you teach your students that they can relate to. And I tend to do this a lot in terms of relating to US culture for pre-departure, and then getting into more of sort of the deeper level culture learning while they're abroad, because they're going through those experiences then, and then they're most interested, most captivated when they're abroad. Re-entry there's a whole section in the guides that has more reflection questions about what they learn and how they feel they can incorporate their learning into their current courses as well as into their life in general. These are examples of things that are covered in these courses. I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm leaving a copy of this with you so you can look at it later as well. And who's offering these types of courses? A lot of this during the abroad experience is happening online. Many of them are using TAs from graduate programs to teach these courses as well. The University of Minnesota, I think, teaches about 700 students every semester using this system. Of course, they have a large TA pool from the College of Education. And in reentry, this is very important with reentry, applying it to their career. It's sort of, is a very practical reason for taking this type of course or talking about reentry in general. And then intercultural competency, being able to articulate what they have learned so that when they're in a job interview, they can say, I was in Japan and I really learned what it means, the difference between a collective versus an individualistic society. I never understood what that meant before until I was there, something like that. Challenges, of course, we've talked about this, staff and faculty time, costs, motivating students to take these courses. Originally, Minnesota required these courses, and then they changed to a voluntary because some of the students complained that they really weren't interested, which is unfortunate. And how do you get them to motivate them to be interested in taking these type of things? Structural challenges, practical ones. And if you're using TAs, how do you train them? So optional seems to be best so far. We're thinking about doing this as like a wellness class at the University of Richmond originally, and then we'll see how interested they are. In the business school, they are requiring this at the University of Richmond. Again, how is this all connected to career professional development? Again, it would be great if we can get faculty involved in talking about this, say in engineering, for example. If you're going to work in an intercultural team, why is it necessary to have these type of cultural concepts and understanding different cultures to work in that international team? So we can get them to really emphasize that this is important in something like an engineering context. Okay, now I'm going to switch a little bit to another program that we run at the University of Richmond, which is the Cultures and Languages Across the Curriculum program. How many of you familiar with CLAC, as we call it? Anybody? Okay. So the focus, right, is not on grammar. It's on communication and context, and it's also focusing on using language to learn a discipline content, right? So let me catch up to my page here. It's the approach is it's an approach to language use and cross-cultural skills as means for the achievement of global intellectual synthesis. And it's really beneficial. Sorry, I have to catch up to this here. I'm a little behind. It reinforces, this is what we have found the most, is that it really reinforces learning for study abroad students who have come back from a semester abroad. We send most of our students abroad for a semester, and they really want to continue in their learning and use the language in, say, political science or in biology, in a law course even. We're starting our first law class section this coming fall for students who can use that in a law context. It's a little different from, say, Spanish for nurses, which is very focused on very specific language and how to use that immediately. This is more learning biology in Spanish is what it is. And then hopefully using that, let's say if you're working again in an international team where you're doing a research project in Spanish on some type of biology-related topic, right? Versus using Spanish for nurses where you're focusing on how you're communicating directly with your clients. Very, very good for heritage learners. And also, as I mentioned to Karen earlier, we sometimes allow international students to do a class section because they are learning here in English, but when they go back to their home country, they need to know the same language, I mean the same concepts, but in their native language that they can use when looking for jobs and working in their own country. Our model is a quarter unit, which is a 1 semester credit here, section connected to a principal discipline course. So as I mentioned, it may be a class section in Spanish connected to a biology course, or maybe a Korean section connected to an accounting class. And they study for 1 hour a week. It's pass-fail. We do require up to an intermediate level, what we call COM2, for students to take the course, although for a less commonly taught language like Korean or Japanese, we may require less. And of course, then there's going to be much more basic terminology being used in those sections. And then we also ask our professors to ask the students who are working in these class sections, and it may be 2 or 3 or 4 working in those outside of the regular class, to bring that learning back into the principal course to help internationalize that course and talk about, let's say, environmental issues in Ecuador that this particular class section studied during their class section in Spanish, so that it brings that perspective back into the regular course. The wonderful thing about this program is that we also if a professor doesn't speak a language, we will ask an international student to be the facilitator for that section, working very closely with the principal course professor. And many of these international students have said to me that they love this because it's one of the best ways for them to work with American students, to really get to know American students closely, and to show them what they know, and also act as an instructor as well. They're filling that out if they want to become professors in the future as well. All right, with that, I think I'm going to stop because it's after 4:30 already. And if there are any questions, I've given you a lot, I know, and went through a lot very quickly at times. But if you have any questions or thoughts or discussion, please feel free.
We're going to ask you to use the microphone so that the camera hears.
I'm going to take some more water while we're waiting. Oh, okay. I think I put, and I had like concluding remarks. I'm going to skip those. Let's see if they are on here. You can go to the Carla website, and they have a way to access the materials through the Carla website. So this will, you have a copy of this that you can access as well. The thing that I would recommend, they used to do workshops on this at the Carla Summer Institute, so they no longer do them, unfortunately. But what I would recommend, if you do decide to take this on, to have a study group, a faculty learning community. I'm trying to start one of these myself at the University of Richmond around these topics so that you really come to it once a month or once every few weeks and really talk about how you can use these materials in class.
Hi, is this on?
I don't think it is. Is it? Oh,
It is on? Okay.
Okay.
So I have many questions, but so one thing I've been thinking about is, as I mentioned before you began, I run a study abroad program that is actually an exchange program. So we do have students from France, from Lyon, coming to the University of Virginia for 1 year. And I'm aware that when they arrive, they want to have their American experience. They want their Frenchness to disappear in a certain way. And I'm always trying to think how best to integrate them. I'm trying to create a community. And but I realize that when they first arrive, they are having these exact same issues that no one's prepared for them to have either, and they have difficulties sometimes. And only in the spring semester are they really able to sort of talk comparatively, and then they want to talk. And they'll if I can get some of them to, I teach a course on contemporary France in the spring, and I get them to come in, and when they're in my class, my students, you could hear a pin drop in the room. They're just so eager to interact with them. And so I've been trying to think just at a very basic level of how to try to help the students who are international students from the country I deal with, France, integrate more easily or figure out some of these things without stepping on their toes either, and allowing them to have their, have their American experience, and how to use them, how to integrate them in later in the year better in coursework. That's one thing. And then I've always thought that the moment when students return from study abroad, we've talked about it so often, it seems like a missed opportunity, and they just come back and then they disappear. And I know we should do something about it. I'm just not quite sure what.
I think I've talked to Mayfin a little bit about how this really needs to be done on an institutional level for the most part. I mean, we can do small things, and some of the things I've done, we don't have I think you have an English language institute here, correct? We don't have that. We have ESL courses for those who need them. And what I've tried to do is to do some of these exercises with them throughout the semester. And these are mainly our exchange students who are taking classes in the ESL Institute. But I would really love to see more on a larger, comprehensive level, institutional level, that we approach this, either through wellness classes that everyone has to take, including, say, the exchange students. They may be required to take one of these, or throughout the curriculum, that there be classes that especially exchange students are interested in, that like an American Studies course or something, where some of these can be brought in, focusing on American culture, so that they understand better our culture when they're interacting with it, right? It needs to start with orientation, and I don't know, do you all do any of these activities with them on American culture within orientation? Okay. And then, and one of the things that I really enjoy, and they enjoy a lot, is this values comparison, because that helps them think, again, sort of the same, the reverse with our students, that these are values on why we do some of the things we do in this country. And so then it's not, again, approaching it as a negative necessarily, but just being different. So for example, I talk about the setup of our cities. Richmond is where we're located. The University of Richmond is just outside of the main part of the city, and it gets into those suburban areas where there's no sidewalks and things like that. So we talk about individualism and collectivism and what that means, and how we love our huge houses, we love our private spaces. We hold parties at our private spaces versus where you might hold that at a restaurant or something in other countries. And of course, again, regionally, this could be a little different, but it helps you start those conversations with the international students based around these values differences. Like I said, I don't have a response in terms of setting up a structure necessarily, except that we bring in about maybe 100, 150 exchange students throughout the year. And we've started setting up what I would call a study abroad program for them that includes all aspects, including we now invite a speaker about the history of Richmond, because that's such an important piece that they may not know. And then buddy program, all those kind of things. And then I do these exercises with them at the beginning. We need to do more, definitely, because I still feel that they are not necessarily grasping all of American culture, especially since ours mostly come for a semester versus a year.
And I guess I would add that from my perspective as a professor in the French department, for instance, it would be very interesting for our students to become somehow involved in that process. Mm-hmm. They want very much to have a connection with the international students, and they think maybe they can, if they had some role to play in that orientation. Okay, yeah.
Right.
And then the other end of it would be that if there's a return, post-study abroad program, I think the students, they really want to do that in the target language. Like, I think there's a drawback almost to doing all of it in English somehow. Mm-hmm. I think they'd be more engaged in it if they could also continue to reflect on and deepen their study abroad experience in the target language. I bet that would be important.
Right.
Here at the University of Virginia, my feeling is that would be important.
I've had different thoughts about reentry lately, and again, time is such a concern, right? But I'm wondering if it's more, if we could come up with sort of cultural mentors amongst the faculty and staff to help students. I mean, we're doing this a little bit now at Richmond. We've started a luncheon series for return study abroad students and international students. We have one big dining hall, and we have a table specifically that we are a staff from our office, and we're going to invite faculty in the future to come talk to students about their experiences, because it's so hard to get them to come to reentry programming, right? I mean, we can get them to come for a pizza party, no problem. And they can maybe talk a little bit about their experiences, how wonderful this trip was or that. But to get them to talk about what it really means is so hard. It's just almost impossible. But we thought by having these sort of once a month lunches that anybody could come to, and then if those who are especially needing it could come to and talk about their needs at that time, we thought that was one way to approach it. This is the first semester we've done that. I'm not sure how successful. The first one was great. Second one, we didn't have anybody. So I'm not sure how successful it's going to be. But if we also have very popular faculty who maybe have had international experiences doing this and opening themselves up for lunches with students, that might work as well, you know?
Hi.
Sure.
Sorry. I'm currently a master's student in Middle Eastern Studies, so I was just wondering how you made the leap from cultural studies to international education, from like your bachelor's and master's into doing like the PhD program.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Sure, I think so. So I did a master's in Spanish, right? Spanish literature and language. And is that what you mean? How did I go from there to?
Because that's personally something like I want to do
Oh,
is my
okay.
PhD in international education. So how, like, what did
Okay.
you do to get there?
Okay. Oh, tough question. First of all, I would say if you can do any type of initial beginning into international education, such as being a study abroad advisor or something like that, do that for the experience. As I showed on the slide, there's more and more universities doing this type of course now for study abroad students and orientation. So that level of being able to train or teach intercultural concepts or language learning concepts is growing. We're still a developing field. I've been in this field now for 30 years and it's changed so much since when I started. So first get into an international office, start doing maybe regular administrative work, develop your skills more and more. And there are places too, and I don't know your training background, but there are places like the Summer Institute of Intercultural Communication in Portland, Oregon, and they now have a winter version at Wake Forest, I believe. It's called the Winter Institute of Intercultural Communication, that you can develop those skills and the background in doing intercultural communication and training. So I recommend, but like anything, these days it's best to have that administrative experience first before you get to this level. Does that answer you at all?
Thank you.
All right.
And Joe, I have a question
Sure.
for you. At the beginning of your talk, you talked about the fact that there weren't any significant differences found between those who studied in a non-immersive context versus those who went abroad and studied. And
Right.
you probably refer to Fried.
Right.
Now, what is the level that Fried was assessing? Because what I've found in my own studies is that I work with advanced language learners. In other words, from the transition between from an ACTFL intermediate to an ACTFL advanced. And what we have found is that those who are exposed to native languages, target languages, and are studied abroad, their language acquisition increases, and their language acquisition is actually faster. So do you remember what the population analyzed by Fried was?
It was more at the intermediate to advanced level. It was those, like you said, who are beginning, progress much more quickly when they went abroad than those who were here back in the United States. And part of that, I think, is because when you go abroad and you're learning that you need to use language, to survive and to get things and those kind of things, then you're going to develop that very quickly, right? Because you're in that setting where you're using it all the time. But I think what they're referring to is those who were at higher levels didn't advance as there was no difference, because here they're very, even though we talked earlier how they're going from several hours a week down to 1 hour a week, they have now the basic to continue that level of language, whereas abroad, maybe they didn't use it that often. Maybe they didn't progress as quickly as they could because of whatever reason, other factors that were involved. It was, I can send, I think I have that on here, this study, the reference to that. But it was, again, focusing more on how the study abroad program, basically the message is, doesn't guarantee that they're going to progress more once they're at that level. But at lower levels, yes, they do progress much more quickly.
And probably a follow-up question to that
Sure.
is, what was the corpus? In other words, was it oral or was it written? Because they're two different
Right.
sets of skills, somewhat
Right.
related, of course, because we're talking about language still.
Right.
But did Free just analyze the oral production? Or how was that
I believe
assessed?
it was just the oral production, and it was for 1 semester, not longer than that. I think those who stay longer a year did progress even further.
Any other questions?
Oh, good.
No?
Nice to meet you.
Okay, if no further
Sure.
questions, then this concludes the session. Thank you very much
Right.
for your attendance, and
Thank
thank
you.
you, Joe, for sharing with you so much experience and wisdom on these
Okay,
issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.